Imagine a map of the Pacific where the sea lanes glitter like nerves in a living body. Imagine the war not as a clash of ideals, but as a contest over three simple things: oil to burn, pilots to fly, ships to carry both. Now reshape one hinge of 1942 and ask a colder question than victory or defeat. Not, could Japan dominate the world, but could it simply survive, carve out a painful peace, hold a ring of islands and coasts, and endure? If that were possible, what exactly must change? And what price would everyone pay for a victory defined not by triumph, but by breathing space? Before we move, take a seat beside me for a kind of disciplined imagination. We will anchor every turn to dates and constraints, and we will respect the difference between suffering and story. If this kind of careful what if is your kind of history, subscribe to What If Wars. Join a community that prefers receipts over rhetoric. Hit subscribe now, then come back to the map. We're going to walk it from north to south, from the winter of 1941 to the heat of 1943, and watch the clock as if fuel drums were hourglasses. The baseline is hard and real. In 1931, the Kwantung Army expanded a war that Tokyo did not fully plan, cutting Manchuria loose as Manchukuo. Through the 1930s, Japan fought China without ever fully mobilizing the industrial base required to end that war on its own terms. Army and Navy competed for steel and doctrine. The Army wanted land wars on the continent. The Navy believed in a decisive fleet action with battleships, even as aircraft carriers quietly changed the grammar of sea power. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on 7th December 1941, it knocked the Pacific Fleet's battleships out for months. But oil, pilots, and shipbuilding capacity remained the larger arithmetic. Japan's refineries depended on oil from the Dutch East Indies, now called Indonesia. It had to keep tankers alive. It had to keep carrier air groups trained. It had to keep industrial lungs, machine tools, steel mills, shipyards breathing under blockade. American codebreakers were not sleeping. Throughout late 1941 and into 1942, U.S. cryptanalysts chipped away at the Japanese naval code JN-25. That work did not read whole novels of enemy plans, but it gave chapters and sometimes decisive paragraphs, enough to cue scouts and set traps. Japanese scouting was brave, but coordination was fragile. The deck cycles that armed, fueled, and launched strikes were tightrope acts with open gasoline lines, bomb carts, and seconds mattering. One mistimed sequence turned flight decks into cafes of exposed ordnance. The aircraft that carried Japan's early war, the Zero and its cousins, were agile but spared weight in armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. That paid off in dogfights and cost dearly when flak and .50 caliber bullets met unprotected tanks. Pilot training was an even more brutal ledger. The pre-war pipeline built aces slowly, and by mid-1942, attrition outpaced replacement. The constraints are therefore exact: secure oil from the Dutch East Indies and protect tankers. Preserve carrier air groups long enough to teach the next class. Adapt industrial allocations away from prestige holes toward what the war actually consumes. And deny the enemy the timing edges created by code-breaking and scouting mishaps. If those constraints bend, survival moves from fantasy to something colder and more plausible. Begin with Midway, 4 to 7th June 1942. In our world, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were lost in a cascade of timing, scouting gaps, and the cruel physics of deck operations. Bombs fell while fueled and armed planes waited. At just the minimum. We do not make the Japanese omniscient. We close one gap and discipline one cycle. The change comes weeks earlier, as the combined fleet staff treats radio security not as a ritual, but as a weapon. Operational deception masks the target enough that U.S. code-breaking yields a weaker prediction window. The AF is Midway hunch arrives with less certainty. The carriers sail with stricter scout aircraft coverage. A few more long-range float planes pushed to the air. A doctrine tweak that makes redundancy a virtue. On deck, the strike doctrine is unglamorous. Instead of flipping loads midstream, the air bosses lock in a single strike profile for the first attack and keep armed planes either on elevators or below, with blast doors shut and fueling lines dry until the moment to spot. It costs tempo. It buys survival. In the morning chaos of 4th of June, that prudence means dauntless dive bombers no longer find decks crowded with live bombs and fuel lines hissing. They hit, but they hit steel and organization instead of tinder. Perhaps Soryu still takes a mortal wound. Perhaps Hiryu is damaged. But at least 2 carriers limp away, and their air crews, veteran cadres irreplaceable in a single season, are not all lost to fire and steel. The immediate downstream effect is not Japanese dominance. It is time. With 2 or 3 fleet carriers still operational by July, the Japanese Navy contests the Solomons with more sting. When Guadalcanal begins in August 1942, the opening months are slower and more expensive for the U.S. Navy. The attritional carrier clashes and the naval night battles that follow, Savo Island, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, happen against a Japanese force with deeper experience on deck and more intact leadership in the air. By February 1943, the Marines and soldiers still win Henderson Field and the island. The difference lies in the price and the calendar. Weeks matter when your pilots come from a narrow pipeline and your tankers must cross seas patrolled by submarines. Here, a quiet ethics note belongs, not as judgment, but as clarity. A longer Guadalcanal is not a chess problem. It prolongs the suffering of men in malaria, swamps, and unsinking ships. The cost of more time is measured in bodies and fevers as much as in tonnage reports. Extend that time with a second lever: logistics and anti-submarine war. In our world, Japan escorted its merchant marine lightly and late. U.S. submarines, once their torpedoes worked reliably, took advantage. And by 1943, the tanker fleet bled out on long, lonely routes from Balikpapan, Tarakan, and Palembang to refineries and naval bases. Change the allocation before the war begins in earnest. In 1941, divert steel and slips from a prestige hull, shave 1 super battleship off the schedule, reduce the cruiser plan, and lay down small escorts with sonar sets, depth charges, and crews trained for convoy work. No one wins medals for convoy duty in year 1, but in year 2, it wins the war of staying power. Introduce convoy doctrine ruthlessly. Tankers sail in escorted packs. Sailing schedules are irregularized. Refueling points are moved under land-based air coverage wherever possible. Radar and ASDEC, sonar, are not special toys but standard equipment, even if the sets are crude and the training imperfect. The doctrine is conservative not on paper, but in fuel and lives. What does that buy? Assume a modest reduction, 20 to 25% fewer tanker losses during late 1942 and 1943 than in our world. Do not imagine safety. Imagine the next exercise takes place because the fuel drums are actually full. That margin means carrier air groups fly 2 extra training cycles per month without cannibalizing operational sorties. It means pilots shoot approaches on clear mornings and bad afternoons, learning to land tired in crosswinds with decks pitching. The sortie count in the Solomons rises in small, meaningful ways. Reconnaissance flights multiply, which in turn closes scouting gaps that bedeviled Japanese carriers at Midway. The morale effect is not romantic. It is a feeling in the gut that the next mission will not be the last, because the tanker on the horizon is not a lone silhouette inviting torpedoes. Meanwhile, U.S. submariners face escorts that drop patterns where before there was empty ocean. Boats still sink ships, but more of them are forced down early. More torpedoes run wasted at odd angles. More merchantmen limp into port and pump aviation, fuel into drums marked for the next month's operations. The American submarine campaign still scales. The U.S. still brings more boats and better doctrine into the Western Pacific. But every convoy forced, every escort laid down in 1941 instead of 1943, shortens the worst carnage of 1944 by compressing it into a contest rather than a harvest. And the fuel that survives into 1943 buys not only combat power, but instructional depth. Japan's pilot attrition after 1942 is still a fact, but the floor is higher. A few more veterans live long enough to teach. And the next class arrives to carriers less brittle because their deck handlers practiced while the tanks were filled. There is a second ethics note owed here. Convoys and escorts change who dies and when. They do not erase civilian suffering in occupied territories where the same shipping carries rice one way and rubber the other. In a longer war of sealift and denial, scarcity sharpens at the edges of every empire. The third lever is political, ugly, and necessary for survival. Soften the occupation where softness buys cooperation. In Manchukuo, the fiction of a monarchy under Puyi already served Japanese ends. Expand the fiction's budget. In Nanjing, the Wang regime functions historically as a reviled collaborationist government. In this scenario, it receives a slightly longer rope, limited civil administration, toned-down exploitation quotas, and hard restraints on garrison behavior that historically fueled rebellion. In Burma, Aung San's complex dance between Japanese promises and Burmese independence is honored enough to reduce the appetite for a full insurgent switchback. In India, Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army is granted more visible autonomy on paper. Parades, flags, training officers drawn from nationalist cadres to harvest legitimacy. In Indonesia, instead of extracting rubber and oil under the lash, Tokyo experiments with councils that include recognizable local figures, trading smaller near-term shipments for lower sabotage and better port throughput. None of this makes occupation humane. It makes it tactically intelligent. Fewer punitive sweeps mean fewer partisans with nothing to lose. A slightly broader circle of collaborators means local police forces handle small fires before they become infernos. Every garrison unit not tied down chasing insurgents is a unit available for convoy escort duty or airfield support. From 1942 to 1944, the difference might be counted in 10 or 15 battalions freed from internal security tasks across the arc from Shanghai to Rangoon. In shipping terms, that could mean thousands more tons of coal and oil moving, because port work is not sabotaged nightly, and because bribes and permissions flow faster through the human networks that actually load cargo. The moral dimension does not vanish. It shifts. Accommodation is purchased with promises that will later be betrayed or renegotiated under duress. People live by cooperating. Others die for resisting. History's judgment does not get kinder because spreadsheets of tonnage improve. By the summer of 1943, carriers still afloat and fuel margins intact create a window. The United States remains Europe first. The Mediterranean distracts. Sicily and then Italy pull shipping, aircraft, and the attention of Allied councils. Tokyo's high command can read that calendar. With fewer sunken tankers and fewer dead aviators, it is not absurd for diplomats to test a limited settlement that would have been laughed out of the room a year prior. The ask is not imperial exuberance. It is a freeze. Imagine the line. The Japanese Empire relinquishes claims that are indefensible or symbolically poisonous to American voters. Public vows to remove garrisons from portions of the Aleutians, end raids against Australia, and accept a demilitarized buffer around Hawaii's eastward approaches. In return, the United States and Britain consent to a ceasefire that leaves Japan in control of Korea, Manchukuo, a collaborationist North China coast, Formosa, and a belt in Southeast Asia that includes key points in the Dutch East Indies, Sumatra's Palembang, parts of Borneo, and selected island positions in the Central and Western Pacific. The Philippines is the sticking point. In any plausible settlement, Tokyo would have to accept some stage path to Filipino self-government under international monitoring, a timetable vague enough to maintain face at home and hope abroad. London has incentives to consider. With North Africa won and Italy in play, British planners thirst for American shipping and planes to keep the European theater fed. Washington has incentives too, a public that can be persuaded to pocket a Pacific armistice if it means Berlin falls sooner. The shadow on the table is the Manhattan Project. Yet in mid-1943, the bomb is promise, not weapon. Bargaining without omniscience is human. The Americans can insist on inspection regimes in the Central Pacific Islands that Tokyo finds insulting. Tokyo can play for time behind a wall of convoys and coastal air power, calculating that every month of stability helps consolidate its co-prosperity in practice, if not in anyone else's speeches. This is not a peace that satisfies virtue. It is a pause that reflects costs. The political price in Washington is rhetoric about finishing the job later. The price in Tokyo is promises to army hardliners that a frozen war is honor, not retreat. Some admirals will choke on it, some colonels will mutter, but ministers who count oil tanks will make the case that survival now is the only path to any future bargaining position at all. The alternative is a grinding war that a maritime industrial superpower wins by suffocation. If the freeze holds through 1944, the 1950s arrive with a different Pacific order. Survival was the objective, not triumph. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere becomes less a sermon and more a customs union by compulsion. Trade runs on yen clearing arrangements and barter-like protocols. Rice and rubber priced in managed exchange. Shipping lanes patrolled by a navy, more practical than glorious. Export quotas for client regimes are enforced by the same logic that created them, but the center learns to pay, if only to be paid back in quiet. Inside Japan, minimal land reform is pushed through not from a love of equality, but to blunt rural unrest. The zaibatsu remain, but live under stricter oversight. Monopolies are tolerated so long as they deliver ships, tools, and fertilizers. A slow technocratic rise takes place in ministries that once served uniforms. The military does not disappear. It becomes more temperate by necessity, choosing to command budgets rather than battles. Fragilities multiply under the surface. Demographics push and pull in ugly ways. A population that needs grain and fertilizer faces a world where nitrates are in competition with armaments and exports. Food security remains brittle. And a bad harvest, plus a shipping disruption, is never far from crisis. Technology gaps widen compared to the United States, which spends peacetime like war on research and integration. Jet engines, radar miniaturization, computing, these widen the gulf in the 1950s. Nationalist resentment simmers in Korea, in Indonesia, in a Chinese coast that remembers forced collaboration. Client regimes wobble when charismatic leaders die or switch sides. The bloc is mercantilist and survivable, not efficient or loved. There is a lesson here about what winning means. In this scenario, Japan wins a conditional peace by addressing 4 unforgiving ledgers: scouting and deck discipline at Midway, convoy protection and ASW built early, pilot training preserved by fuel, and occupation adjusted to collaborate rather than bleed. Those choices trade legend for longevity. They also trade justice for order, and the bill for that arrives slowly. Over the years, courtrooms and prisons fill where battlefields would have been. Surveillance states mimic garrisons. Education curricula carry the weight that bayonets once did. The human cost does not disappear. It becomes less visible, which is a different kind of danger. The third ethics note belongs to the civilians who never volunteered. In any prolonged empire, even a softer one, the line between cooperation and coercion blurs until families make choices for bread that future histories will call treason. To say this scenario is plausible is not to praise it. It is to admit that systems can endure by making ordinary people's lives depend on them. Return to the specific evidence that gave this survival its spine. Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 created a schedule, not a guarantee. Battleships sunk, but oil tanks at Oahu intact. American carriers at sea and angry. Midway from 4 to 7 June 1942 was solvable only in portions. Code-breaking advantage narrowed, scouting redundancies added, deck cycles disciplined, fuel management set against impulse. Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943 then becomes a meat grinder the empire can survive. Better, not avoid. U.S. code-breaking against JN-25 remains an opponent. Japanese operational security can only dull it. Japanese scouting and strike coordination remains stressed. Improved training and fuel buy repetitions that turn chaos into competence. Convoys with escorts make radar and ASDICs into daily work rather than rare assets. U.S. submarines still hunt, but some are denied the straight, slow targets they once enjoyed. Pilot attrition after 1942 remains brutal, but intact carrier groups and a funded training syllabus preserve a scaffold of veterans, living textbooks who teach the next class how not to die. Industrial allocation tensions no longer defer to the Yamato class as national icons. Instead, light carriers and escorts multiply, ugly ships that give beautiful numbers. Constraints in steel and machine tools do not vanish. They are managed by ministers who accept that merchant ship plate and escort keels matter more than a battleship's reputation at anchor. Proxy governance is not decoration. It is plumbing. Manchukuo's bureaucracy, the Nanjing regime's civil front, Burmese nationalists like Aung San negotiating leverage, the Indian National Army parading a tricolor beside a rising sun, Indonesian committees allocating labor, these become the gears that move cargo and keep garrisons small. Food and fertilizer are not epilogues. They are the numerator and the denominator of stability. Without nitrogen for fields, without shipping schedules that prioritize grain, any mercantilist bloc starves its own claims. The post-war mechanics of a yen-clearing area, bankers balancing paper because warships force them to, are uncomfortable but real. People adapt to rations and coupons. Black markets become gray. The line between stability and stagnation becomes the question that educated youths whisper about in dormitories, and that police write reports about afterward. If this sounds like a narrow threading of needles, that is because it is. It asks a proud navy to trade decisiveness for discipline. It asks a militarist state to accept a pause that feels like humiliation. It asks occupied peoples to accept collaboration that feels like survival. It does not ask the United States to lose its will. It asks its leaders to bargain when Europe screams louder, and when the Pacific Front looks like a plateau rather than an escalator. When the Manhattan Project finally births its weapon, the politics become even stranger. An armistice line policed by inspectors and patrol aircraft may live under a nuclear cloud. Deterrence arrives early and awkward before doctrines have words for it. The first tests in the desert become an argument in Washington to resume the war, while in Tokyo they become an argument to concede inspection regimes or island withdrawals to avoid annihilation. The map does not freeze forever. It sweats and shifts as scientists and admirals whisper into cabinets. There are personal lessons beneath all this machinery. In any complex conflict, the bottleneck that matters most is often boring. Training syllabi, convoy schedules, radio discipline. Grand strategy wins headlines. Logistics and institutions win tomorrow. Political flexibility that looks like weakness on a parade ground looks like survival in the ledger of calories and sorties. And ethical clarity must be guarded as fiercely as ships. To say a soft occupation buys stability is to confess how easily humans will trade rights for quiet when the alternative is famine. That is not a lecture. It is a warning from a possible past to a very real present. Now draw the map one last time and set the question like a stone in the middle. In 1943, with carriers still flying and convoys guarded, do you accept a limited peace that freezes Japan's empire behind a ring of patrol planes and customs houses? Or do you refuse, push the war to 1945, and accept the casualties and fire that such a choice implies? If you were in a cabinet room, hearing reports from Midway to Guadalcanal, measuring oil by barrel and pilots by name, which door would you open? Tell me in the comments. Not with slogans, but with reasons. The calendar you would count, the numbers you would prioritize, the lives you would try to spare. And if you want more histories that dare to be specific, dates, tonnage, training hours, the small changes that tilt big outcomes, subscribe to What If Wars. That subscription is how we keep building stories that respect both the record and the people inside it.